Under the soft blush of dawn, Ethan Carter stepped onto his sunlit porch, pausing to savor the quiet promise of a new day. His home, an impeccably maintained colonial nestled in a friendly suburban enclave, had long been his sanctuary. Every element of the property, from the meticulously trimmed hedges to the white picket fence that hugged the front yard, spoke to a life earned through hard work and sacrifice. A decorated military veteran who had transitioned into a respected city official, Ethan poured his heart into preserving this haven, a testament to the resilience and independence he cherished. Here, in the gentle interplay of light and shadow across his garden, he found solace from a past of service and the persistent challenges of bureaucracy. Every morning, the familiar creak of the wooden steps and the rustle of leaves in the garden served as a quiet reminder of the values he held dear: integrity, self-reliance, and community spirit. It wasn't just a house. It was a living archive of memories, dreams, and battles won. In the space where classic cars awaited restoration in his garage and neighbors exchanged friendly greetings over steaming cups of coffee, Ethan's home stood as a beacon of his personal triumphs and the promise of freedom from unnecessary interference. Yet, as the day broke, a dissonant note began to disturb the harmonious routine. Unbeknownst to Ethan, a storm was brewing not in the skies, but within the confines of his own neighborhood's governance. A storm fueled by an overzealous adherence to arbitrary rules and an entitlement that had seeped into the very fabric of the Homeowners Association (HOA). At the center of this brewing conflict was Kerren, the self-appointed arbiter of community standards. With a reputation for uncompromising strictness and a penchant for micromanaging even the smallest details of daily life, Kerren had become synonymous with HOA tyranny. In her eyes, every deviation from her rigid interpretation of proper home aesthetics was not just a minor oversight. It was a direct affront to the community's well-being. Kerren's relentless enforcement of the HOA's convoluted guidelines had earned her a formidable aura of authority among the board and a notoriety among residents. To her, every homeowner was a potential rule breaker, and every deviation from a perceived standard was an opportunity to assert control. It was this mindset that set the stage for the collision course between Ethan's fiercely guarded freedom and the increasingly overbearing demands of the HOA. The tension first came to light on an otherwise ordinary morning. As Ethan prepared to leave for work, a role that not only allowed him to serve his community, but also afforded him a keen understanding of the nuances in local laws, he was startled by the unexpected arrival of a figure at the edge of his driveway. Standing there, clad in a sharply pressed blazer and exuding an air of self-assured superiority, was Kerren herself. Flanked by two other board members, whose expressions were as stern as they were impassive, she carried an unmistakable aura of someone convinced of her moral and legal high ground. "Good morning, Ethan," Kerren began, her tone saccharine yet laced with an unyielding authority that left little room for debate. "I'm here to address certain discrepancies regarding the proper use of your property. It appears that some of your recent modifications do not align with the established community standards as dictated by our HOA guidelines." Taken aback by the sudden confrontation, Ethan's well-honed composure was momentarily tested. He had always prided himself on his respectful demeanor and his unwavering commitment to fairness. With measured resolve, he responded, "Kerren, I've always taken great care to maintain my property according to both the spirit and letter of our community guidelines. I'd appreciate the chance to review these concerns with you so we can arrive at a reasonable solution." But Kerren was not in the mood for discussion. With a dismissive gesture and a smile that dripped with condescension, she replied, "The rules apply to everyone, Ethan. Today, it is your responsibility to correct these issues immediately." Her words, sharp and final, resonated in the cool morning air as a declaration of war, a war waged not with weapons, but with fines, threats, and an ironclad insistence on conformity. As Kerren and her entourage turned and strode away, leaving behind an unsettling mix of stern warnings and bureaucratic finality, Ethan felt the first sting of injustice. His cherished home, once a symbol of personal freedom and quiet dignity, was now poised to become a battleground. In that moment, The simple act of preserving his sanctuary was transformed into a stand against an arbitrary system determined to police every aspect of his life. A seed of defiance was sown in Ethan's heart, a determination to defend not only his property, but the very principles of individual liberty and fairness. Even as the echoes of Kerren's parting words lingered, he vowed that no fine, no warning, and no overreaching regulation would force him to compromise the values that had guided him through years of service and struggle. The day after Ethan's initial confrontation, the calm of his suburban morning was shattered by an unwelcome discovery. As he stepped outside, still reeling from Kerren's unyielding declaration at his doorstep, he noticed an official envelope affixed to his front door. Its stark, embossed seal left no room for doubt. It was from the HOA. Inside lay a formal notice, a fine of $750 for violating community light regulations, a charge that Ethan knew to be nothing more than a pretext for Kerren's personal vendetta. Standing a few paces away, Kerren appeared as if she had been waiting for this moment. Clad in her signature blazer and sporting a self-satisfied smile, she leaned casually against a parked car. With her arms crossed and her eyes narrowed, she greeted Ethan with a tone that brooked no argument. "The rules apply to everyone, Ethan," she said coolly, as if reciting a well-rehearsed mantra. "It's time you corrected these infractions immediately." Ethan's first instinct was to protest the unfounded allegations. "I've maintained my property according to all the local ordinances and community guidelines," he replied steadily, his voice betraying none of the inner frustration. "I'd appreciate if you could provide the exact details of these so-called violations." But Kerren's response was swift and dismissive, a curt, almost mocking, wave of her hand that signaled the end of any discussion. The notice, however, was just the beginning. Later that morning, as Ethan busied himself with his routine, an unexpected flurry of activity erupted outside his home. Several vehicles bearing the insignia of local inspection services pulled up, and uniformed inspectors began pacing along the perimeter of his property. Their presence, coordinated and methodical, hinted at a premeditated move. It wasn't long before one of the inspectors approached Ethan with a clipboard in hand, his tone clinical and detached. "We've received multiple complaints regarding your property," he explained, "and we're here to verify if there have been any breaches of municipal code." Ethan, a seasoned city official with years of experience navigating local regulations, instantly recognized the setup. "I assure you," he stated firmly, "everything here complies fully with the law." Undeterred, the inspector noted down details and scheduled a follow-up visit, leaving Ethan with a sinking feeling that the fine and the subsequent scrutiny were part of a larger orchestrated plan. Kerren's strategy was becoming ever clearer. With the HOA's imprimatur behind her, she had mobilized every available resource to intimidate Ethan. In the ensuing hours, formal warnings arrived by mail, each one couched in legal jargon and topped with the unmistakable seal of the Homeowners Association. The letters cited obscure clauses and ambiguous regulations that left little room for interpretation, except for those who understood that these were nothing more than traps designed to snare someone who dared to question the HOA's authority. Ethan knew his rights, and with a deep breath, he resolved to stand his ground. Relying on his extensive knowledge of local laws, he meticulously reviewed each letter. It quickly became apparent that many of the allegations were baseless, if not outright fabricated. Determined to fight the injustice, Ethan promptly drafted a formal response. In his letter, he outlined the legal discrepancies and cited the relevant local statutes that invalidated the HOA's claims. He emphasized that while he respected the role of community governance, no regulation could legitimately infringe upon his lawful rights as a homeowner. The correspondence was sent not only to Kerren, but also to the local zoning office and other relevant municipal authorities. By doing so, Ethan hoped to shift the balance, forcing a review of the HOA's aggressive tactics. His calm, fact-based rebuttal stood in stark contrast to the theatrics that had defined Kerren's approach from the outset. Within days, the situation escalated further. Rumors began circulating in the neighborhood, anonymous tips suggesting that several other residents were facing similar arbitrary fines and intrusive inspections. It became increasingly clear that Kerren's ambition was to assert a total monopoly over what should have been a cooperative, community-centered environment. At neighborhood gatherings and over casual conversations by the mailboxes, whispers of resentment grew louder. Many residents started to question whether the stringent measures enforced by the HOA were truly in their best interests, or merely an excuse for Kerren to wield unchecked power. Yet, even as the community started to murmur, Kerren's tactics only intensified. She took it upon herself to oversee every inspection, positioning herself as the sole arbiter of compliance. With a smug sense of entitlement, she began issuing additional warnings for any minor deviation, an overturned flower pot here, a slightly trimmed hedge there. It wasn't long before Ethan found himself not only battling a fine he knew was unwarranted, but also facing an environment where every small action was scrutinized for signs of dissent. At the heart of the chaos was Kerren's belief that she was infallible, a conviction that allowed her to manipulate the system without regard for fairness or justice. For every legal document Ethan sent, Kerren countered with a barrage of threats and procedural maneuvers. In her mind, she was the guardian of community standards, and anyone who dared oppose her was, in essence, a criminal defying a sacred social order. In this high-stakes game of bureaucratic brinksmanship, Ethan resolved to fight back. His response was calculated and deliberate, a mix of legal fortitude and a steadfast commitment to preserving his rights and the values he held dear. Every move he made was a declaration that no arbitrary fine, no matter how officially stamped or legally cloaked, could erode the very essence of his independence. As the day drew to a close and the last of the inspectors departed, Ethan stood before his front door, the weight of the challenges ahead heavy upon him. Yet, in that moment, his determination was unshaken. The fine, the warnings, and the relentless harassment were not signs of his downfall. They were the opening moves in a larger struggle for justice. And Ethan, with the calm resilience of someone who had faced greater battles before, vowed that he would not be cowed by an overreaching system built on entitlement and intimidation. As the days passed, the battle between Ethan and the HOA evolved from bureaucratic skirmishes into a full-blown war of attrition. What had begun as a single, isolated fine soon multiplied into a series of aggressive and increasingly illegal maneuvers orchestrated by Kerren. No longer content with issuing warnings and monetary penalties, she now threatened far graver consequences, false violations that hinted at eviction notices and even the seizure of property. One breezy afternoon, Ethan returned home to find an unexpected letter posted on his door. The envelope bore a foreboding insignia and a hastily scrawled warning, a notice of violation for an alleged unauthorized use of common space. The language of the document was laced with legal jargon, though Ethan quickly recognized that the claims were not supported by any real provision in either the HOA guidelines or local law. It was clear that Kerren was determined to escalate the conflict by manufacturing a crisis where none existed. Disturbed by the brazen overreach, Ethan began to suspect that there was more to this barrage of fines and threats than mere enforcement of community rules. In the quiet moments of the evening, after carefully reading through the newly arrived document, he set to work investigating the inner workings of the HOA. His background in public administration and law had equipped him with the skills necessary to scrutinize legal documents, and soon he began to piece together a troubling pattern. Several of the fines were based on vague, subjective criteria, and in at least 2 instances, board meeting minutes revealed that decisions had been made behind closed doors without proper authorization. Ethan's inquiries led him to confidential conversations and whispers among a few fellow homeowners. One neighbor confided, "I've seen Kerren change the rules on a whim. Today it's one thing, tomorrow it's another. It's as if she's running the HOA like her own personal fiefdom." This was the break Ethan needed. Quietly, he reached out to other residents, gathering testimonies and records that hinted at deep-seated corruption within the board. It appeared that Kerren's iron-fisted approach wasn't merely about enforcing standards. It was a cover for a broader agenda to centralize power and enrich herself at the expense of the community. Amid this turmoil, A surprising development unfolded at an emergency board meeting convened by Kerren. In the dimly lit room, as Kerren recited yet another litany of supposed infractions and penalties, a couple of board members exchanged uneasy glances. Their expressions hinted at growing doubts about the legitimacy of Kerren's actions. When a particularly outrageous charge was levied against a resident for the misplacement of a garden gnome, one board member, Mr. Delgado, a longtime community stalwart, murmured, "Isn't this a bit far-fetched?" The comment, though whispered, did not go unnoticed. A ripple of quiet dissent began to spread among the more cautious board members. Emboldened by these subtle signs of internal resistance, Ethan decided to act. Late one evening, after ensuring that his living room was secured with cameras, he began to document every interaction and every suspicious maneuver. His home, once a symbol of peace, transformed into a makeshift command center. Stacks of printed documents, copies of meeting minutes, and photographs of the unauthorized notices formed a growing dossier of evidence. With each piece of proof, Ethan's resolve strengthened. This was no longer a battle for a single fine. It was a struggle for the rights of every homeowner subjected to Kerren's capricious rule. During one clandestine meeting with a few trusted neighbors, Ethan laid out his plan. "We have clear evidence that these fines and threats are baseless," he explained, spreading out his collected documents on a battered dining table. "Kerren's actions are not only illegal, but designed to intimidate us. It's time we use our collective voice to challenge this corruption." The meeting buzzed with cautious optimism as the group agreed to pool their resources and prepare for a legal counterattack. They decided to approach a local attorney known for fighting bureaucratic abuse, a lawyer who had built a reputation on standing up to powerful entities. In parallel, Ethan intensified his own efforts to document every encounter with the HOA. On one occasion, while Kerren was making a routine visit to assess another alleged violation, a misaligned mailbox that she claimed disrupted the neighborhood's aesthetic, Ethan covertly recorded the exchange. Kerren's tone, laced with veiled threats and unsubstantiated accusations, was captured in stark detail. "This isn't about aesthetics," she sneered. "It's about ensuring that every inch of this community adheres to our standards. Failure to comply will result in consequences you cannot imagine." The recording would later serve as a damning piece of evidence in the burgeoning legal case. As the days turned into a tense standoff, more board members began to question the legitimacy of Kerren's decisions. Some privately approached Ethan with concerns about the irregularities in the meeting minutes, while others admitted that the rapid succession of fines seemed designed to scare residents into submission. The seeds of dissent that Ethan had nurtured were now beginning to sprout, promising a united front against an overreaching power. Kerren, however, remained undeterred by these signs of internal dissent. Instead, she doubled down on her aggressive tactics, convinced that any challenge to her authority would only prompt a stronger response. In her mind, the HOA was her personal realm, a space where she could enforce her will without question. But as evidence mounted and allies rallied behind Ethan's call for fairness, the balance of power started to shift. What had once seemed like an unstoppable force of entitlement now appeared vulnerable, its foundation cracking under the weight of undeniable proof and collective resistance. With every false violation and every veiled threat, Ethan and his growing coalition inched closer to exposing the deep-seated corruption at the heart of the HOA. The conflict was no longer just about a single property or a petty fine. It had become a fight for justice, transparency, and the very soul of the community. One crisp morning, Ethan awoke to an unsettling sound of heavy machinery rattling outside. Rushing to his window, he saw a scene straight out of a nightmare. Bulldozers and heavy-duty trucks had gathered by his driveway, and workers were already at work. In a scene of calculated chaos, Kerren had orchestrated an extreme move under the pretense of expanding sidewalks for the benefit of the community. She was demolishing a portion of his property. For Ethan, whose driveway had been a source of pride and a symbol of his hard-won independence, this was the last straw. Fighting the rising panic, Ethan quickly called the local authorities and his attorney. His heart pounded as he documented the scene with photos and video, capturing the wreckage of his personal sanctuary. The workers, armed with official-looking documents, insisted that they were acting under the HOA's directives. But Ethan knew better. This was an unapproved act of aggression aimed squarely at intimidating him into submission. Later that day, at the hastily convened HOA meeting in the community center, the tension was palpable. The room was packed with residents, many of whom wore expressions of concern and disbelief. Ethan arrived with a thick folder in his hands, containing legal documents, photographic evidence, and audio recordings. Every piece of evidence meticulously gathered over the past few weeks pointed to a systematic abuse of power and blatant disregard for local laws by the HOA, particularly by Kerren. As the meeting commenced, Kerren took center stage, her demeanor as unyielding as ever. With a forced smile, she attempted to justify the destruction of Ethan's driveway by citing vague community improvement plans that, upon closer inspection, had no legal basis. Her words, however, were drowned out by the murmurs of disapproval from the audience. Sensing the growing dissent, Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady and resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, projecting his words with the authority earned from years of public service, "what you're witnessing is not a community improvement plan. It's a flagrant violation of our rights as homeowners." He then methodically presented his evidence, a series of documents that clearly outlined the boundaries of the HOA's legal jurisdiction, the improper permits or lack thereof that had been used to justify the destruction, and photographs showing that no proper notice had been given prior to the work commencing. A hush fell over the room as board members exchanged uneasy glances. One resident, emboldened by Ethan's clear exposition, stood up and asked, "If this is truly for our benefit, why weren't we informed? And why target Ethan's property specifically?" The question resonated deeply, exposing the underlying issue. The HOA was less about community improvement and more about Kerren's personal vendetta. Kerren's face reddened as she attempted to regain control. "This is merely a precautionary measure," she insisted. "We are only doing what is best for the neighborhood." But her words rang hollow against the weight of the evidence Ethan had laid before them. A local attorney, sitting in the back, quietly whispered to several neighbors that he'd seen similar overreach in other cases, a sentiment that emboldened the community's growing mistrust. As the discussion intensified, one board member, Mr. Alvarez, took a firm stance. "I have reviewed these documents," he declared, his tone both measured and decisive. "It is evident that the HOA has overstepped its authority. What Kerren is doing is not only unauthorized, but illegal." His statement shifted the atmosphere further, as more residents began to express their support for Ethan's claims. In response to the mounting pressure, Kerren's posture faltered for a brief moment, a flicker of panic that was quickly masked by a stubborn glare. Instead of admitting fault, she doubled down. "If anyone has a problem, they should take this up with the city council," she challenged, her voice wavering slightly under the collective scrutiny. But her deflection did little to quell the outrage in the room. Ethan, seizing the moment, announced that he had already taken legal action. "I have filed a formal complaint with the local zoning board, and I'm prepared to seek an injunction to stop any further unlawful actions by the HOA," he said firmly. His declaration was met with a wave of applause from several residents who, until now, had felt powerless in the face of arbitrary HOA decisions. Throughout the meeting, the tide of opinion clearly turned against Kerren and the corrupt practices of the HOA. Neighbors who had once remained silent now shared their own experiences of arbitrary fines and intrusive inspections, adding personal testimonies to Ethan's evidence. A community forum was proposed on the spot, urging all affected residents to join forces and demand a full investigation into the HOA's actions. Kerren, visibly shaken by the united front against her, tried to salvage her authority. Yet each argument she made was countered by clear facts and the collective resolve of the community. In one dramatic moment, when she attempted to dismiss the evidence as misinterpretations, an elderly resident recounted how similar tactics had been used against him in the past. The room erupted in murmurs of agreement, a unanimous repudiation of the tyranny that had been allowed to fester for far too long. By the end of the meeting, it was evident that the power balance had shifted irreversibly. Ethan's bold move in exposing the illegal overreach of the HOA not only thwarted the immediate threat to his property, but also ignited a broader movement among the residents. They were now more determined than ever to reclaim their rights and ensure that no one would ever again fall victim to such blatant abuse of power. As the meeting adjourned, Ethan's gaze met that of several relieved faces. In that moment, it was clear the HOA's reign of terror was on the brink of collapse, and Kerren's desperate attempts to maintain control had only further exposed her vulnerability. The community had spoken, and justice was beginning to take shape. In a last-ditch bid to regain control and silence the uprising, Kerren hatched a plan so reckless that even her closest allies began to question her judgment. With the community rallying behind Ethan's revelations, she realized that the stakes had escalated beyond routine fines and bureaucratic threats. Desperation drove her to execute an extreme maneuver that would, she hoped, force the narrative back in her favor. Late one chilly evening, as the neighborhood lay quiet under a heavy blanket of fog, Kerren dialed 911 with trembling urgency. In a voice tight with barely contained panic, she reported that Ethan's porch lights were causing a public disturbance, a claim that would soon spiral into a convoluted police involvement. Within minutes, the wail of sirens split the night, and 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of Ethan's house. Ethan, who had been reviewing his growing dossier of evidence in the calm of his study, was startled by the unexpected commotion. Answering the door, he was met by a pair of officers. Recognizing the absurdity of the claim, he calmly flashed his city official badge. "Officers, I assure you there's no disturbance here," he stated with a measured tone. The cops, already on edge after being summoned on what they later described as a false alarm, turned their attention to Kerren, who was now at Ethan's doorstep, wringing her hands and demanding immediate action. Her frantic insistence that the lights constituted a hazard fell flat against the backdrop of clear, rational explanation. The officers, unimpressed, questioned her motives and subsequently dismissed her complaint. The brief standoff, laced with Kerren's desperate protestations, left little doubt about her intent to use the law as a tool for intimidation rather than justice. But Kerren's tactics were far from over. In a bid to dig up dirt on Ethan and shift the focus of blame, she covertly hired a private investigator, someone rumored to have a shadowy reputation for bending legal boundaries. This PI was tasked with gathering any information that could tarnish Ethan's reputation and undercut his legal counterattacks. Yet, in her haste to orchestrate this covert operation, Kerren overlooked a critical detail. One night, as Ethan reviewed security footage from his home's newly installed cameras, he noticed something peculiar. A figure matching the description of the PI, stealthily creeping around his garage and peering through the window. Realizing that this was the evidence he needed to expose the lengths Kerren was willing to go, Ethan immediately preserved the video files. The footage, grainy yet damning, clearly showed the PI attempting to tamper with Ethan's private property. In a subsequent conversation with one of his trusted neighbors, who was also a retired law enforcement officer, Ethan confirmed that the investigators' actions constituted trespassing and an illegal invasion of privacy. This was the break that would shatter Kerren's final facade. Determined to ensure that her unscrupulous tactics would not go unpunished, Ethan compiled the security footage along with detailed logs of the events. The following week, at the next HOA meeting, an assembly that had already transformed into a forum for airing grievances, Ethan unveiled the evidence. As the room fell into a heavy silence, he connected his laptop to the community projector and played the incriminating footage for everyone to see. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps filled the room as the PI's furtive movements were laid bare before an audience of irate homeowners. A murmur of disbelief and anger rippled through the crowd, punctuated by the realization that Kerren's campaign of intimidation had descended into outright criminality. Amid the collective shock, several residents began questioning Kerren's credibility. "If you're resorting to espionage against a fellow homeowner, what else have you been doing?" one voice demanded, echoing the sentiment of many. Kerren's face turned a deep shade of crimson as she struggled to formulate a response. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a mounting panic. Instead of addressing the evidence head-on, she stuttered incoherently, attempting to dismiss the video as misinterpreted context. However, the community was no longer swayed by her arguments. The evidence was irrefutable, and it was clear to everyone present that her actions had crossed a line. In the ensuing chaos, the board members, many of whom had already grown skeptical of her leadership, voted to launch a full internal investigation into her conduct. Legal counsel was summoned, and discussions of potential criminal charges for trespassing and fraud began to circulate. Kerren's desperate measures had not only backfired, but had also cemented her reputation as a figure willing to trample the rights of others in pursuit of power. As the meeting drew to a close, Ethan's steadfast demeanor contrasted sharply with Kerren's unraveling composure. The once ironclad enforcer of HOA rules was now exposed as a desperate, overreaching individual who had stooped to unlawful measures. In a final poignant moment, Ethan addressed the assembled residents. "We came together for the promise of a community built on fairness and respect. Let this be a reminder that no one is above the law, not even those who are supposed to uphold it." The room erupted in applause, a symbolic repudiation of Kerren's tyranny and a reaffirmation of the community's collective will. In that moment, it became evident that Kerren's days of unchallenged authority were numbered. Her final, desperate move had not only failed to intimidate, but it also triggered a reckoning that promised lasting change. As the meeting adjourned and neighbors exchanged determined glances, Ethan's victory was clear. The corrupt practices of an entitled few had finally been exposed for all to see, and the fight for justice had reached a decisive turning point. In the wake of the explosive revelations at the HOA meeting, the community's simmering frustration finally burst into organized action. The incriminating evidence against Kerren had served as the catalyst for a chain reaction that no one had anticipated. In the days following that damning presentation, residents began rallying around Ethan and his allies, united by a shared resolve to reclaim the integrity of their neighborhood. The transformation was swift. What had once been a placid, if oppressive, atmosphere within the HOA boardrooms turned into a hotbed of dissent and demands for accountability. One by one, long-suffering board members began to break ranks with Kerren's authoritarian regime. At an emergency meeting convened in a local community hall, a majority of the board members voted in favor of launching a formal investigation into the practices of the HOA. The motion was passed overwhelmingly, marking the beginning of the end for Kerren's unchecked power. Simultaneously, local media caught wind of the controversy. A feature story highlighting the plight of several homeowners, along with the damning footage and documented evidence, ignited public interest far beyond the confines of the neighborhood. Within a matter of days, the story had spread on social media and local news outlets, putting additional pressure on municipal authorities to act. City officials, alarmed by the growing outcry, ordered an independent review of the HOA's operations. This investigation quickly revealed systemic abuses, arbitrary fines, unauthorized property modifications, and a pattern of neglecting due process. As the legal and public relations battles intensified, Kerren found herself increasingly isolated. Neighbors who had once been too timid to voice their concerns now spoke out with passion and clarity. At a specially convened community forum, several homeowners recounted their experiences of harassment and unjust fines. Their personal stories resonated deeply, reinforcing the argument that the HOA's actions were less about preserving community standards and more about consolidating power for a single, overreaching individual. Amid this mounting pressure, the city imposed a hefty fine on the HOA for violating local regulations. The fine was not only punitive, but also symbolic, a clear message from the authorities that abuse of power would not be tolerated. This punitive measure crippled the HOA's financial resources, casting doubt on its ability to continue operating under its current model. With funds dwindling and public trust eroded, several board members resigned in protest, further destabilizing the organization. Kerren, once the unquestioned enforcer of HOA rules, now stood as the public face of its downfall. At a pivotal vote held by the entire homeowner community, she was formally removed from her position. The vote was decisive, a powerful demonstration of the residents' collective will. In the ensuing chaos, Kerren attempted to salvage what little control she had left by insisting that the remaining board members adhere strictly to the outdated, arbitrary rules. However, her pleas were drowned out by the overwhelming support for a new beginning. As the investigation continued, more damning details emerged. It turned out that Kerren had misappropriated funds and engaged in questionable financial practices, using the HOA's money for personal expenses rather than for the community's benefit. This revelation not only deepened the community's sense of betrayal, but also led to criminal charges being considered against her. Local law enforcement, now backed by substantial evidence, began to pursue formal charges for fraud and other related offenses. The community, once oppressed under Kerren's rule, was beginning to envision a future free of the tyranny that had plagued them for so long. Homeowners organized a series of meetings to discuss how best to restructure the HOA into a truly democratic organization, one that valued transparency, fairness, and respect for individual rights. Ethan emerged as a natural leader during this period of transformation, guiding discussions and helping to draft new bylaws that would prevent any single individual from ever gaining too much power. The collapse of the HOA's old order had far-reaching consequences. Within a week of Kerren's removal, her once proud residence was put on the market, symbolizing not only her personal downfall, but also the end of an era. In contrast, the community's mood was buoyed by a newfound sense of empowerment. Residents celebrated their victory with informal gatherings on their streets, where neighbors talked openly about the lessons learned from their shared struggle. In a final twist of poetic justice, as Kerren packed her belongings amidst the whispers of scandal and public humiliation, Ethan quietly observed the transformation from his front porch. The tranquility of his home, once besieged by unwarranted fines and relentless harassment, now radiated a renewed promise of community solidarity and personal freedom. The story of the HOA's collapse would become a cautionary tale, a reminder that no individual, however entitled, could hold an entire community hostage forever. The legal reckoning for the HOA began shortly after the public outcry reached its peak. City officials, now armed with the overwhelming evidence gathered by Ethan and other vigilant residents, launched an in-depth investigation into the HOA's practices. It wasn't long before the findings painted a damning picture. Not only had the HOA enforced non-existent rules, but it had also collected fines under false pretenses, misappropriated community funds, and manipulated regulations to serve private interests. The turning point came when the city imposed a substantial fine on the HOA for its systematic abuses. The penalty was not only punitive, it was designed to signal that public institutions and community organizations alike were not above the law. As news of the fine spread, more homeowners came forward with stories of their own mistreatment. The collective testimonies lent further weight to a decision that would change the course of the neighborhood's future. Emboldened by the legal backing and the surge of community support, Ethan spearheaded a class action lawsuit against the HOA. He worked tirelessly alongside legal experts, ensuring that every arbitrary fine and every unwarranted intrusion was meticulously documented. With every piece of evidence submitted, the case against the HOA grew stronger. Neighbors who had once been silenced by fear or confusion now had a clear path to reclaiming their rights, and they were eager to take it. As the lawsuit gained momentum, it wasn't just the HOA that faced the wrath of the legal system. Several board members, who had either knowingly or negligently turned a blind eye to the misdeeds orchestrated by Kerren, found themselves under scrutiny. The investigation revealed that many had been complicit in a scheme that enriched a few at the expense of the many. Some board members were called in for questioning, and legal charges began to be considered against those who had actively participated in the corrupt practices. Meanwhile, Kerren's attempts to salvage her position crumbled under the weight of mounting evidence. Every legal document, every statement by a former board member, and every piece of tangible proof contributed to a narrative of deliberate abuse and neglect of duty. Even her close legal ally, a shady lawyer whose questionable tactics had once been a shield against accountability, came under investigation by the State Bar. The scrutiny not only isolated Kerren, but also threatened to dismantle the entire network of support she had built within the HOA. In a final act of defiance, Ethan made his last power move. At a community meeting that was more a forum for justice than a mere formality, he laid out the comprehensive case against the HOA. With calm conviction, he explained how every fine, every threat, and every unauthorized action had been a calculated step in a larger pattern of abuse. His words resonated with every homeowner present, transforming the gathering into a powerful display of collective will. The verdict was clear. No institution was allowed to overreach, and no individual could dictate the terms of community life without facing the full force of the law. As the lawsuit moved forward, legal analysts predicted that the HOA would not only be forced to compensate the affected homeowners, but would also face severe sanctions. The judicial process promised to set a precedent for community governance, ensuring that transparency and fairness would become non-negotiable standards in local associations. The outcome would serve as a stern warning to any entity that sought to manipulate power for personal gain. In that decisive moment, the community realized that their struggle had transcended personal grievances. It had become a battle for justice and accountability. The full legal consequences facing the HOA marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the rights of individual homeowners would be fiercely protected against any form of institutional overreach. As the full force of legal and community scrutiny descended upon the HOA, Kerren's personal life began to crumble in tandem with her public facade. Isolated and ostracized by the very people she once manipulated, her days became a relentless reminder of the consequences of unchecked power. With every news headline and social media post recounting her abuse of authority, Kerren's reputation fell from grace at a staggering pace. In the quiet hours of one autumn evening, Kerren found herself alone in the empty halls of her once prized residence. The home that had symbolized her power within the HOA now echoed with a hollow sound of regret. The neighbors, who once trembled at the mere mention of her name, now spoke of her in tones of disbelief and scorn. Rumors had spread that not only had she misused community funds and manipulated rules, but that she had also alienated many close friends and colleagues through her relentless pursuit of personal gain. The collapse of her personal life was as swift as it was brutal. Her husband, disillusioned by the public humiliation and the endless barrage of scandal, filed for divorce, leaving her to confront the harsh reality of her actions alone. Financial troubles compounded her predicament. Her credit rating nosedived after a series of fines and legal fees drained her resources. A once immaculate car, symbolizing her status, was repossessed, leaving her scrambling for an alternative that matched neither her former lifestyle nor her dwindling bank account. Each setback served as a painful counterpoint to the power she once wielded. Former friends and acquaintances, who had long endured her authoritarian demeanor, began distancing themselves, leaving Kerren with an ever-growing sense of isolation. Invitations to community events, once seen as opportunities to assert her authority, were no longer forthcoming. Instead, she was met with cold stares and whispered comments whenever she attempted to navigate public spaces. The transformation was complete. The woman who had prided herself on being the ultimate enforcer of rules was now the subject of cautionary tales, a living example of what happens when entitlement goes unchecked. One dismal afternoon, while passing by a local cafe, Kerren unexpectedly encountered a familiar face, Ethan, who had once stood as a symbol of resistance against her tyranny. His calm demeanor and steady gaze conveyed not triumph, but rather a quiet pity for a woman who had lost her way. "I hope you've learned something from all this," he said softly, the words carrying a blend of finality and empathy. It was a moment that underscored not only her downfall, but also the community's commitment to upholding fairness and justice. The final blow came during an unceremonious HOA meeting, now restructured under democratic principles. The board, once dominated by her influence, voted unanimously to expel her entirely. With no legal or social foothold remaining, Kerren was forced to sell her house in a distress sale, further symbolizing the total disintegration of her empire. The new owner, a young couple eager to infuse fresh energy into the community, could scarcely believe that the property once belonged to the infamous HOA enforcer. As Kerren packed her belongings into a modest rental truck, the contrast between her former opulence and her current state was stark. Every item she left behind served as a relic of a bygone era when she believed herself untouchable. Now stripped of her power and shunned by those she had once controlled, Kerren was forced to confront the bitter truth. No amount of authority could shield her from the consequences of abusing that power. In the aftermath, as the community rebuilt itself on the principles of transparency and respect, Kerren faded into obscurity, a cautionary tale of entitlement, corruption, and the inevitable downfall that follows when one loses sight of justice. Her story served as a stark reminder that no one, regardless of their perceived influence, is above the law or beyond the reach of collective accountability. In the weeks that followed the dramatic upheaval, the neighborhood settled into a quiet yet determined rhythm, a far cry from the tense days of strife under Kerren's rule. The air, once heavy with the anxiety of arbitrary fines and relentless scrutiny, now carried a subtle note of liberation. Neighbors gathered in their front yards and on quiet sidewalks, exchanging smiles and stories of how they'd reclaimed their rights. The community had not only survived the ordeal, but had emerged stronger and more united. Ethan's home, which had been the flashpoint of the battle, now symbolized hope and renewal. From his well-lit porch, he watched as new initiatives took root. Community gardens sprouted in once neglected spaces, and spontaneous gatherings became a common sight. It was as if the very spirit of the neighborhood had been revitalized, a shared understanding that when people band together, even the most entrenched abuses of power can be dismantled. At the next HOA meeting, now reimagined as a community forum with transparent decision-making, the atmosphere was lightened by a touch of humor. A neighbor with a mischievous grin presented Ethan with a novelty HOA violation notice that cited excessive neighborliness as a breach of outdated regulations. Laughter erupted around the room, a cathartic acknowledgement of the past's absurdities and a celebration of their regained freedom. It was a small, yet powerful, reminder that the community had not only reclaimed its rights, but also its sense of humor. The transformation was visible in every corner of the neighborhood. Bulletin boards were no longer dominated by lists of fines and penalties. Instead, they showcased community events, art projects, and messages of unity. Local shops, once cautious under the shadow of oppressive oversight, now boasted vibrant displays of community pride. The long-forgotten park bench outside Ethan's home, a silent witness to many past confrontations, had been repainted and now bore a plaque. For the community, by the community. In the final moments of this long and turbulent chapter, Ethan took a quiet walk through his neighborhood at dusk. The sunset bathed the streets in warm hues, a striking contrast to the cold, unyielding light of Kerren's former rule. Every step was a testament to the enduring power of collective will, a reminder that justice and decency could prevail even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As he paused at the corner where neighbors once quarreled over petty fines, Ethan couldn't help but smile. The echoes of past conflicts had faded, replaced by laughter and the soft murmur of shared conversations about new beginnings. The legacy of Kerren's tyranny was now a cautionary tale, a story recounted with a blend of disbelief and humor, a mic-drop moment that signified the end of an era. In that serene twilight, the neighborhood was no longer defined by the scars of past oppression, but by the promise of a future built on fairness, respect, and community spirit. The final chapter had been written, not in the ink of conflict, but in the warm, enduring hues of a community finally free.